Hey everyone and welcome! You probably guessed it by the video title, the thumbnail, or if you are into racing games, you can probably hear it in the soundtrack as well. This is Raceroom, and they hit a major update, and I'm gonna look at the UI and particularly the force feedback because this is what interests us the most. Let's go to the game, and you can already see that when you go to, well, the settings coming from the main menu, it has a major overhaul. It just looks completely different. It falls, yeah, it has new buttons, everything. The whole order of things is reworked. And I just want to talk about, first of all, in every menu in every racing game, you need those bars. I mean, most games have that, some still don't. And I'll tell you why. Because you want to know what your settings you're adjusting actually do to your input. So I have the wheel set up at 720 degrees, which means one full rotation into each direction, which means this is now half a rotation, and that should be half the input. Which, though, you only get, where's the steering sensitivity? Down here. At 50% is the standard value. So now half a rotation on my wheel equals half the input in the game as well, of course, into both direction. Now, if you change the sensitivity, you put it up, then half a rotation on my wheel, so half the input I can do equals 3/4 of the input in the game. If I do it vice versa and decrease the sensitivity a lot, then now it takes half a rotation on my wheel to barely get any input. In this case, pretty much quarter of the input in the game. But then it becomes a lot more sensitive in the other half, where suddenly 3/4 of the input are covered by half a rotation. What you want basically is this to be linear, perfectly linear, which is what the 50% setting does here. So half a rotation is half the input, full rotation is all the input, and well, same is true for everything in between. So this is why you want these bars, right? And everything. Same for the brake, of course, right? Though not much that we want to do here. We want to look at the force feedback, and I think what they did really well is to implement this graphic on the top right here, because it gives you an indication of, yeah, what the force feedback settings actually do. And I think every game should have that, show what every force feedback setting really does, because some games are ridiculously quiet about all these settings unless you go into 5 layers deep forum posts, and it should be in the game, and Raceroom does it right. There's a huge amount of explanation for every setting, and that's the only way to do it, period. Okay, so what does force feedback strengths do? So I can either read the text, or I can just use the, well, the slider, right? And then I immediately get an idea, and the longer I look at it, the more sense it makes how this slider affects the overall force feedback. Okay, so the higher I put it, the more forces I get, and everything kind of gets scaled up and down. Small forces get bigger, big forces get bigger, everything kind of the same. Then I have the linearity, which is going to change something different. And now you can see, while the gaps between high and low forces kind of remain the same, you can see that, well, within the range of the lower and the higher forces, there's going to be less or more detail. In the case of less linearity, the smaller forces will be all a bit scaled up, while the differences in the larger forces get a bit smaller. Okay, so this is what the linearity does, and you want, on a direct drive at least, 100% linearity. On the very weak wheel like the Logitechs or Trustmasters in the lower range, you probably maybe want to scale up the small forces a bit to get more detail from the steering wheel. And I think this is perfectly shown here in this chart on the top right. Then you have a minimum force, and it obviously does that. It lifts everything up, cuts down the range a bit. So a smaller force will be a bit bigger, a bigger force in comparison will be a bit smaller, but you have a consistent minimum force in there at maximum of 15%. So there's always some resistance. Good. What else do we have? The maximum force. And now this slider comes down in the graphic and just perfectly also shows you what happens to the force feedback if you change the maximum force, or if you just have force feedback clipping, because that's what's happening, right? Your maximum, so at some point, a force of, say, this is 10 Newton meters or here, then it just gets cut off when your wheel can't display it because it can't produce 10 newton meters, for example. And this is what the maximum force here does. And yeah, if you put it really, really low, you lose all force feedback detail, and all you get is a basic resistance, basically. Okay, so on the direct drive, you want to keep this up. Maybe on the weaker wheels again, you can cut something off at the top. But also, this is going to happen by itself, just from force feedback clipping. Okay, I think so. This is a really good way, I think, to work with force feedback setting, indicating what they do. And then the stationary friction would be something not affecting the overall chart because it's only for the driving scenario where you're not driving. So this is the friction you have sitting in the pits, turning the wheel with the tire, kind of scrubbing across the surface. Don't think we will need much of that because, well, we want to drive, not park in the pits. Another nice thing they have is you can have a field of view calculator now. And I just did that for a quick setting. So here's my really advanced tool, checking the distance while driving from the screen to my eye. And I can tell you it's something. I think it was 62 earlier. I figured out it calculated the field of view for me of 88 degrees, which I found too narrow. So I took that as an indicator. But then went up to 100 degrees again, so I can at least see the side mirrors of the car, which for me more interesting than sitting perfectly accurate. And now I think I just want to take it to the track. A car that I know, a track that I know. I've competed in the Ford GT GT1 in at least one race 2 years ago, so I know how it should drive. At least I think I remember it a bit. And then want to test the force feedback, of course. So let's see what they've built here. Press any key. I pressed any key. Car setup. I'm not sure you can see this. So my testing before, I can already tell you that the force feedback standard multiplier in here is car specific. Many games do that. And I think it was set to 1.5. And I felt I at least needed to increase that to a factor of 2. So I have more force feedback from the car, else it felt a bit too little. For my personal preference at least, and not too much detail shining through. The car does not have traction control, so it should give us a nice idea of oversteer. I actually had to redo the video because this car is so insanely loud you couldn't hear me talk before. And that is something, like the only area in the game where Raceroom does not and cannot improve, I think, is audio. Let's take it slow. So that was a bump in the first corner, okay. There's some resistance in the corner. It all feels very spring driven, like this whole thing here feels like it's always the same force. So middle of the corner, the force here, this is all the same. There's very, very, very tiny differences. And they are just slightly speed dependent, basically. There was an oversteering moment, putting the power down. And I think in the corners, resistance is there, how the tire is loaded. But it feels like... I'll tell you on the main straight. You could feel the front flocking up as well. So okay, you feel the curve, but it's more an indication that, hey, this is a curve. It's not really the height of the curve itself or so really running into your arms. Oopsie. And you don't have too much force feedback change from off throttle, on throttle. It's all more or less based on, yeah, I don't know, how fast you go through the corner, basically. Not so much on... just missing a few things that the car is doing, even though there's some bumps that I can feel. I need to enforce more oversteer. But the main thing that bothers me is this. I'm on a main straight doing 250, and I can turn the steering wheel with my little finger with barely any resistance. And I think this is something that I do not like. I do notice when I clip the curb there, fine. And I do get the information of the oversteer. But it feels a bit, I think muted is the word. So again, now the force is kind of the same throughout the whole corner. Now the oversteer comes, I can't correct it, okay? So I do get the information. But it doesn't feel too crisp. It's all kind of there, but it's not as direct as I think I would want to have it. I mean, I'm basically hitting a hard edge at a speed of 200, and I would think it should feel less rubbery, spongy. It's not sharp in a way. And then there's one more thing, but I think this might be down more to the game itself. Which is that I'm not sure if they have actual laser scans. Because the road itself is, yeah, like without any type of information, I have to say. Unless for, or apart from the bumps that they deliberately built into the track, like here. And you can do feel the curves, but the road itself is kind of without information. And this kind of leads me to get a perception of I am connected to the car, but I'm not really connected to the road. But I don't think it's a force feedback issue. It's more an issue of with the track surface lacking detail itself. Kind of feels like the bumps are put there by human hand, not scanned into the game. Okay, let's finish this lap. And then I'm gonna stage something. So I do get the oversteer here, okay. I can control the slide, that's perfectly fine. But I don't feel much change to the force feedback or car behavior. For example, when I go in and out of the throttle or on the brake, there isn't really much effect to the force feedback from that. Or how the weight travels around the car. I would say I'm not really feeling this. I'm just feeling the standard resistance from the front tires going through the corner. That's the main force I'm getting. So overall, this feels a bit lacks detail in a way. Not important detail, but immersive detail, I want to say. And now I want to do something that you'll find interesting. So the game, of course, has flat spot simulation, and you'll have that in the force feedback. So that's one good thing. If you lock up the front tires while turning in, the force on the wheel immediately stops, so you know, okay, the tire is locking. And then as soon as the tire stops locking up, you get all the force into, or snaps back into the wheel, so you know when it's not locking up anymore. So this is good. And now I definitely do have a flat spot on the tire. I think you might be able to tell when I go through a corner, load the tire up. Okay, it's still kind of okay. It's harder in the right corner, so you can see my arm is shaking from the force feedback right now, which makes me think the left side tire got locked up. So let's lock up the right side tire. That should be one on the right side now as well. So I have proper, you can hear it in the voice, I guess. Let's try in the next corner that the flat spot is going into the steering rack, into the force feedback calculation, into my wheel, into my arms, into my voice. Just can't make the right tire as worse or as bad as the left side one. But I'd say this is at least a cool detail. I mean, ACC has that too. But for the ABS, you of course can't lock the tires up as brutally in ACC as I just did here on purpose. Okay. Some stronger vibrations at higher speed. Right part is completely zero information of you going over a curve except from the audio, but not in the force feedback. However, I am connected to the car. I think my conclusion will always be this. I'm connected to the car, but I don't feel necessarily connected to the road, which I think is more an issue of the game itself lacking the detail on the laser scan, or if they have laser scans at all, I don't actually know. And this is not down to their force feedback working in a weird way also. Let's try another car as well. Just to have some variety in there. So this was a GT1, and I think I want to go for a GT3. And why not take the car that my wheel comes from? So it doesn't get more realistic than that. Same track. And load the whole thing again. I think I already made changes to the setup so that we have traction control allowing us some oversteer. Yes, continue. So car setup, and you can see this is the way I set up the traction control. So I have 6 settings, and I can do it manually, starting 40%, going down to, well, 0% TC. And I felt like 10% still gives you a reasonable amount of oversteer to work with, so we can play with the car a bit. Drive, not going to do much. You can tell looking at the wheel. Graphics-wise, the game is just not there anymore. Sadly. Sound-wise, though, it is. There's a reason this is one of the craziest cars ever built. Or craziest GT3s. So on this car, the force feedback, I think overall is even less. Like now there's the power steering pump coming into play as well, maybe. So it's definitely, again, all a bit softer, a bit muted more even. On the straight, the same issue of everything being a bit light. In the corner, though, the tire loads up, but again, it feels like it's more just based on speed and the steering angle alone. It's not really based how the weight travels around the car. You just don't really feel the detail there, I would say. And I did change the force feedback factor here on the car as well to 2.3 even, just to get, yeah, something out of it. So now I do feel the curbs now. They're definitely not as harsh and crisp as they are in ACC, for example. But it's reasonable, right? It gives you the information where you're driving without there being something that lacks from a, yeah, what do I need to do as a driver perspective? So this is all there. If anything, it's an emergent thing. Now let's turn the TC up to something where we can take a look at the oversteer a bit more. So 10% of TC now instead of 40. And at least in the lower gears. This should give us some oversteer in Q1 to look at. Again, on the straight, it is more now with the force feedback multiplier on 2.5 instead of 1.5. Force feed oversteer is there, as you can tell. Almost cracked my hands, which is the next issue. I feel like I need to turn the oversteer, I need to turn the force feedback up so much to, I don't know, get a nice experience, so to say, that I also come to a point where some forces get so large that they might become harmful. if you're not aware of this happening. So oversteer, I think, again, it's there nicely. You can definitely tell when the whole car starts moving around the front tire, which wants to go straight. That's where the oversteer in the end comes from, or the oversteer perception in the steering wheel. So this is all good, right? I'm in charge of the car. No issue whatsoever. But then going onto this curb, there's just nothing happening. I do feel a bit of vibration there or so, and yeah, okay, the car is kind of climbing that curb, I can tell that. But it's not like I'm feeling what the surface does to the car's behavior, really. I just get I don't know, plain information of over what type of surface I'm driving. But I don't know. I don't feel like I'm getting exactly what I would expect. Or maybe it's just me being too used to the ACC FFB. And we should ask someone who's more familiar with the game. Maybe we'll add the next couple of weeks or so a small interview with Moritz Lerner or so, who, well, mains this game and has gone through all the development stages of it with all the force feedback stages that we had in the past. There, this bump you can definitely feel, but again, I feel just overall the road lacks a bit of detail, and the force you have going into the corner is just, yeah, pretty much the same all the time, and it's not really changing based on what's happening to the car or the road underneath. It's just, yeah, a rather numb force. And the weird thing is when the car goes from understeer to oversteer and back to neutral, basically, it always feels, I don't know, like you have a spring in there that's oscillating. It just snaps back in a weird way. It's not really, it's not firm, it's not solid. You always have these periods in the steering where it becomes completely light. And I think there should just be, yeah, I don't know, there should be at least I would think that way. There should or would be a force that is kind of always there despite that. Right now, it, yeah, again, feels a bit like a spring oscillating a bit, and I can't really believe this is the way it would be. Again, I think for driving, actually, let's park the car here. I think from a driving point of view, it is intuitive to drive. You get all the information I think that you need from a driving perspective, what the car overall is doing, or at least what inputs you need to give. But it doesn't feel like you get all the information that should be there, particularly things from the road, which could be down to the laser scan or so. Um, and the other bit is that going into a corner just always feels like the same force every corner, every time. Just based on speed and your turning angle. It doesn't really feel like the load of the car is traveling around. You can't really tell if you're going into a corner with a light rear or so. It just always feels the same and just lacks a bit of, I don't want to say detail. I rather want to say fidelity and sophistication, basically. And I'm not sure if this is down to the physics of the game in general, if this is down to the road surface, or just to the force feedback. But I just feel there's even more information to have about the car in, for example, at least for me personally, the FFB in ACC. Even though, again, this is very intuitive to drive. I think everything is there to control the car, really. Just from a, I don't know, immersion perspective or amount of detail, sophistication, whatever you want to call it. There could be more. What I do like though is the whole thing they did to the menu, because I think that is really helping the user. It really is a user interface now. It helps the user use the game, not as some other user interfaces that seem to fight the user more than help it. So I think this is a really good step forward. I think you best check it out and let me know in the comments what you think about this Force Feedback. I think it's a step forward, but I guess there's more to have. Either way, have a good weekend. Peace.